Hey y'all, remember, if you like my work, like, share, and subscribe. It really goes a long way on my end. Now, I really should shut up about that and get to narrating, shouldn't I? Hope you enjoy. The Charon Incident, an original series by Charlie C.C. Thomas. Part 2, Translation. 2 days after orbit. Jane held herself beside Jonas in the pilot seat, Andrea and her both creeping over his shoulders as they watched the monitor. The feed from the aerial drone didn't have much lag, but the 5-second delay was enough to make Jonas's eyebrow twitch as he tried to manually adjust it away from one of the middle ring's stone cliff faces.
Cap, just let auto kick in,
Andrea said, still eyeing the monitor. Jonas pushed himself back, seat straps adjusting to hold him in place as he pursed his lips with irritated eyes. He sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose, nodding wordlessly before he let his arms hover in 0G and watched. Andrea. Don't call me Captain, please. Jane smirked as she and Andrea found one another over his head. They grinned before returning to the screen with a chuckling,
Yes, sir.
from Andrea.
Where is this?
Jane asked, eyes flicking over the aerial drone's stabilizing feed, motioning between it and another, one high above most of the structure. Jonas pointed to the innermost ring of 7 near the top of the screen. We should be cresting in a few seconds, and we'll finally see this head on. Jane nodded, lips parting as she gripped the pilot seat hard and drifted closer. Her eyes darted between the screens, lingering on the one from near orbit and ignoring the pit opening in her stomach. It was real, she knew. Every dream, everything the man had told her, the man himself. But staring at proof was something else. Following the concentric arc of the 7 rings, topped with slender spires just like she dreamt. Watching the dirt fall off of a 4-sided pyramid dotted with balconies like she'd dreamt. It made her heart pound in her temples. Then, the drone crested the top of the ring and hovered, swiveling to scan its surroundings. Jane shuddered, her lips falling open as she swallowed down the bile and pushed her feet back to the floor. There it was. The rings. The stone flowed together like roots and vines, rising in organic hills around platforms surrounded by 5 pillars, always 5. Pathways shot out between the platforms, even wrapping around the inner face of the ring. In the distance, the other rings rose out of the ground, waterfalls of dust littering their sides, each crowned with spires that glinted like crystal in the distant sunlight. But amid the rings, in front of the drone, rose the massive pyramid. The 4 sides of the top were steep like in her dreams, dotted with canopies over balconies now covered in dirt and ice, with the base a series of massive square steps. She swallowed and waited for the set of 7 arches to open up the structure, but it was just more steps. Jane furrowed her brow and went to ask if the drone could circle around, but Jonas had already ordered it to explore before moving on. It pushed on, using minimal thrusters in the low gravity, and categorized the reoccurring structures as it recorded them, marking them for investigation for the ship's computer. And, after only a few minutes, Jonas ordered the drone over the inner edge, tired of the repeating pattern, and followed a path in a curved arch to another platform parallel the pyramid. Jonas furrowed his brows. That's weird. The drone's fighting horizontal pull like the ring's generating its own gravity.
Technically, everything has gravity though, right?
Jane asked, flicking between him and the drone. Yeah, but this is too much. And it's getting stronger by the second. The drone's using more fuel to hover, and more still. He sighed through his nose and shook his head with a nervous giggle, ordering the drone closer to the pyramid. Enough breaking the laws of physics for now.
Can you circle around?
Jane asked.
Yeah, there should be an entrance to this thing somewhere, assuming it's anything like the pyramids on Earth.
Andrea smirked.
But these are aliens, so who knows?
What? You don't think this was built for our long-lost ancestors, that we're what's left of a dead civilization? Jonas chuckled.
No.
Andrea laughed.
This wasn't built by us.
Jane said low, but the others still heard her and looked puzzled.
It looks like it's outfitted to accommodate something like us, but Just look at it. Pyramids are a pretty basic shape that hold up under a lot of strain.
Andrea said.
Every alien species out there probably uses or has used them. But do they fly without propulsion?
Jane asked with a quirk of her brows. They do if they're spaceships, Jonas said low, staring at the monitor.
And if it's not a spaceship?
What else is it? An art project? Jonas breathed a laugh.
A generator.
Jane breathed, then froze along with everyone else as the drone came to the structure's face. She swallowed, eyes wet and heart skipping a beat as her hands lifted off the seat into 0G.
The arches.
It was almost a whimper as her lips quivered. The front of the pyramid was just as she'd dreamt, with a series of stairs and courts carving between the massive walls of the step base. But the light was gone. The gold was gone. The intricate weave of the stone roots and branches were filled with dust and rock. The glyphs that should have been visible were packed with ice, the fountains didn't flow, and the archways were sealed with massive solid doors covered in swirling lines. Jane furrowed her brow, stomach leaping.
What is this?
She thought.
It isn't supposed to be like this. It's been buried for 700 years.
Jonas sighed. Well, there's your entrance. He gestured to the monitor. You want to knock?
Drink your coffee, Mr. Grinch.
Andrea said absently as she came closer, squinting at the video.
There's a seam running down the walls in the arches. If it's mechanical, we might be able to trigger the doors and see what's inside. What if there's an atmosphere?
Jane rushed, snapping to face Andrea.
What if something's alive in there? Do you really think after however long there's anything in there?
Andrea asked kindly.
It's a ruin, Jay. It activated for a reason. What if there's a lone survivor? What if we destroy this thing in the process and completely stop what's happening?
What if this is a planet-breaking weapon and we accidentally save humanity by opening the doors? Jonas countered.
Wait.
Andrea raised her hand, silencing them.
Look, the seams are growing. I think the doors are opening on their own.
Jonas looked up and grinned at Jane's relieved face. Looks like you don't have to worry about killing the aliens.
I don't think we could if we tried.
She thought, and smiled down to Jonas.
But the gardens...
The drone pressed forward over the courts and what should have been floors carved to look like rushing water frozen in time. Instead, washed in a blanket of dirt and frozen mud. Jane's shoulders slumped as the drone passed the last fountain and ascended the steps to the 7 arches, their doors barely open but wide enough for the drone to fit through.
Any trace of foreign atmosphere?
Jane asked. Jason analyzed the thin air and shook his head, same as the local Charon atmosphere, before ordering a full breakdown from the drone's sensors. Light spectrum analysis, magnetic, temperature, phonic, even chemical and elemental from the dust in the air. Doesn't look like anything that'll hurt the little guy, but the magnetic field's more than doubled since yesterday. Jonas flicked to the other screen, and his lips went tight. That energy readout's almost 10 times what it was. If this is a weapon, it could destroy the whole planetary system.
I'll take Micah's word on that.
Andrea teased. Jason grinned as he pressed the drone through one of the arches on the right, sampling the material and nodding his head in her direction. Fair enough. Jane straightened as the drone passed the threshold into the hungry black, eyes flitting over the screen as the drone activated its lights. Everyone went silent and stiff. Unblinking eyes glued to the screen as the lights reflected and glittered on the polished golden walls of the enormous antechamber. The floor was awash in murals and circular strings of text. The walls were covered in pictograms and symbols between giant enclosed scenes, 2 spheres with the structure between them, a mass of men surrounding a pyramid or mountain with light coming from the peak, creatures with wings encircling an ornate burning throne while others came and went from another lone sphere. Tears welled in Jane's eyes as she grinned. Then she cleared her throat and blinked them away, pushing down the excitement and warmth in her chest.
Luke's gonna want to see this.
Not that he could read it, Jonas said half to himself, gawking at the video as the drone hovered higher until it hung nearly centered.
This is fantastic.
Andrea laughed the words, smiling wide enough to show teeth, leaning forward so quickly her feet kicked up behind her until she hovered horizontally.
Look at those reliefs. The craftsmanship. God, they're humanoid, same proportions. This must be a temple, or carved with religious imagery to invoke some higher authority at least. Maybe it's a way station or a political center.
Jane didn't answer, just grinned to herself as the camera spun, flashlight sending refracted beams back and forth over the polished metal. It wasn't gold, she remembered. It was an alloy. Then, the cameras passed over the back of the room and massive doors in either corner. Oh my God, Jonas marveled, leaning forward. Are those angels? Andrea stared, brows furrowed.
If I'm not mistaken, they look almost like cherubim.
Jane finished with a chuckle, pushing herself upright with a laugh before she covered her mouth and composed herself.
Cherubim, guarding doors. Doors?
Andrea asked, and Jonas maneuvered the drone to better look between one of the pairs.
There's another seam. How'd you know? Cherubim always guard something.
Jane answered slowly, flicking between Andrea and Jonas.
Maybe the garden's behind there. But seriously, there could be an atmosphere. Scan for heat and vibration other than that caused from the local activity.
The drone switched one of the cameras to infrared, and the doors bled warmth, only the barest trickle at the seam, but enough to be strange. Then it approached and set an instrument to the seam, registering faint vibrations alongside the tremors from the pyramid's ascent.
It's still behind there,
she thought, grinning when she remembered the man said he still tended the garden.
There could be a whole ecosystem behind there, the last remnants of some civilization or planet long lost.
You know, for a Christian, you are cozy with the aliens. Jane rolled her eyes.
Again, aliens and God aren't antithetical.
Andrea would have smiled at that, but her eyes still hadn't left the screen.
You should release the other drones to scan this entire thing. Every groove and crack. Me and Luke are gonna have a field day. Take a sample of that material, too. I need to know if that's gold or some kind of alloy.
Jane said. It took 5 hours for the rest of the drones to leave their launch station in orbit and begin the massive undertaking of scanning the interior of the antechamber. 5 hours of the entire crew bent over a tablet or two, reading the newest data, comparing notes, shouting from one end of the shuttle to the other. 5 hours of non-stop work that made Jane's brain seep from her ears until she hovered in one of the cylindrical passages in the front of the shuttle. Her eyes fluttered half open as she reread analyses of the material, an alloy of 19 elements that shouldn't make a stable bond, 2 of which that shouldn't be in the Kuiper Belt at all, and the same stuff like the rest of the structure was made from. She blinked and shook her head as she read Andrea's notes on the reliefs and followed Luke as he passively drifted in the shuttle, completely absorbed in his attempt to catalog every symbol and image. Then her eyes shut on the waking world and opened in the dreaming one. Jane, the man said. She spun around to meet him, the jungle of the garden around them with hundreds of arcing domes overhead, each intersecting the others with dangling points that glinted like chandeliers with their own light. She looked at him, giant that he was, and strode forward. Her brows knitted as her mouth fell open to speak, but he interrupted her. The time's nearly come upon us. Soon the instrument will take its place, and you can behold its beauty in life as you have in dream.
It's all real. Really real.
He smiled kindly down at her, and she grinned, laughing at herself.
I knew it was, but to see it when I'm awake, with the others around me.
Evidence that you're not insane? He asked, and she nodded. I wouldn't speak to you if you were.
But what is this place? I know you've said it makes light, but what does it do?
He grinned like he'd explained it all so clearly before. The instrument is designed to create light to heat the surfaces of Charon and Pluto so they might flourish for a time. Likewise is the purpose of the magnetic field you've detected.
And how? This thing doesn't make sense. It makes its own gravity, generates tons of power without any ionizing radiation, moves without any moving parts. The instrument is crawling out of kilometers by strata by hovering. How? Why?
It's a machine, made with technology that you could understand if given enough time and patience, just as Adam might have come to understand a maglev train.
You're calling us primitive?
Aren't you? You've walked great strides, but only so many. The race is far longer than 3 steps, and to reach the end in time you must run, not waddle. He grinned apologetically and knelt so they were eye to eye. As for the reason, the one who made it loves beauty, and so made it to bring it forth as the sun does when its light catches the dew or blazes in the clouds. You smile and wonder at it, as an artist can wonder at his own work. So does this one marvel at his.
But who is he?
She asked, a hand on his shoulders, holding him closer as she flicked between his burning eyes.
Where is he from? Is he like you?
He laughed at that and shook his head. I am as much his creature as the instrument. We are not the same race, for he has none. She furrowed her brows, eyes drifting in thought as she mouthed the words to herself.
So, you have a race then? You belong to a people? You're not a monolith?
He nodded, like one might to a child. I am one of a host of others, many trillions of trillions and more. But we did not build the instrument. In fact, we've built nothing. We live in the works of he who has made them, and tend them, and obey him.
Is he the last of his species? How did he create your people? Can we meet him? Learn from him?
He smiled wide like she'd recited his favorite line of poetry, then cupped her face and stroked her cheek, his hand encompassing her whole head. He wants nothing more than for you to know him. It's what he most keenly desires for you. She swallowed, licking her lips as she studied his alabaster face, half hoping she were wrong, that she didn't know who he was.
Why did he bring us here to see?
So you might understand something that will be important in times to come.
Will we live to see the instrument rise again?
I don't know. No one can know the future, even me, Jane, save that which is certain. He lowered his hand and stood. It's soon that you'll wake. Have you any more questions?
Too many.
She laughed.
Where did you come from? What are your people called? Are you here to help us? Teach us?
Our name cannot be pronounced by your tongues, but you may call us messengers, and we come from the heaven above heaven, more distant from this world than your telescopes could see.
How did you get here then? Are you a scout? Why are you alone?
He smiled wide and shut his eyes with a chuckle. You have uncovered the interior of the pyramid. There you will find the writing of all that has happened to bring about what you see, and its purpose here, and for you. You need only read. She laughed. He nodded, understanding, and reaching into the breast of his heavy tunic to pull out a small stack of paper. He held it so she could see the face and all its glyphs, those carved into the stone and golden alloy, each made perfectly beside the rest in horizontal lines. He tore the corner of one page and held it in front of her face. Take and eat. If you wish to learn, then you must take it within yourself. She looked at the paper, then him, and back before she opened her mouth. He set the piece on her tongue and it dissolved, leaving nothing behind. It tasted like nothing, but as she swallowed, her throat warmed. When she took the next piece, it settled in her gut. The next radiated warmth from her stomach. The next wove up her spine and knitted itself in her head, and the next and all the rest until the 7 pages were gone. He smiled and touched her forehead, wiping his fingers over her eyes until they were shut. When she opened them, she blinked against the sterile light of the shuttle and Luke still placidly coasting back and forth. She blinked and cleared her throat, swallowing the warmth down and shaking her head as she pushed from the passage to the cockpit, asking how everything had come along. The debris field's almost completely gone, Micah told her from beside the door, and nothing else has been kicked up. Next thing to hit orbit will be the structure, Jonas said beside the pilot seat. It's sped up, more than 3 times its speed yesterday. Heck, double what it was when we set the drone out earlier. Magfield's gotten stronger too, and the energy output in the middle of the pyramid's still increasing.
Is that where it is?
Maybe. Jonas clarified with a sigh. He rubbed his eyes and looked back at the monitor. Poor Luke. I wouldn't even know where to start.
The glyphs? They're all documented, right?
Jane coasted to the other side of the seat and watched the 3D render of the pyramid spin and zoom into the antechamber, every glyph and mural outlined. She blinked as the image zoomed into the glyphs in a sweep, but they weren't just symbols, not even signs she could see some pattern in. They were words. Her mouth drooped open as she squinted and hung over the monitor, then backed up as Jonas eyed her. You good, Jay? She nodded with a nervous chuckle, but never took her eyes off the glyphs, reading them in her head.
In the time before kings, there stretched his hand beyond the sphere of man into the dark waters far from the power of the greater light. And there he made to be a mighty work that rested between two spheres, whose inhabitants were bitter of the winter. Thus sparked he summer in their skies, and made them another light to draw up the frost of cold for the dew of spring.
She read another line, and another, and a fifth and 10th, then pushed herself back to wordlessly enter the shuttle passage. She shoved herself after Luke on the opposite side, grabbing his arm and spinning them mid-air as he lurched up at her with angry, confused eyes.
We need to talk.
Jane, I have an entire pyramid to decipher. I can't pass up the chance to be the first one to translate an alien language. I'm the first alien anything ever discovered that happened to be in our solar system. She gripped his shoulder with gritted teeth.
Now. And I may be able to help with that.
You cannot be serious, Luke said, leaned against his closet compartment.
I am.
They're dreams, Jay. Manifestations of your subconscious aren't actual manifestations. This dream guy isn't real.
Then how do you explain everything?
She gestured forward, moving off the opposite wall to her feet, brows knitted in annoyance.
The scale of the structure. I dreamt that, Luke. The number of rings, the fact that they were rings and unconnected to the pyramid. The fact that the central structure isn't a pyramid but a diamond. That the whole thing will disconnect from Charon and position itself between the bodies. All of that was in my dreams.
He stared at her, chewing the inside of his cheek while the rest of his face teetered between slack and constipated. Like you said before, your subconscious was telling you things that you missed when awake. That's what every warning in a dream is. It's no different than the faces you see. They're people in passing your brain uses to fill the gaps. Jane sighed, jaw clenched as she leaned back on the wall and crossed her arms, voice low and careful.
The rings, the ones you told me about. The man told me about them, that you'd lost them nearly a year ago.
That's no secret, he said carefully.
He told me things you didn't. How your parents each died.
Jane stopped.
Brain cancer took your mother.
She stared at him as he went silent, the aggravation melting away until he was slack-jawed and gawking, arms drooping as she spoke.
No one knew anything was wrong until one day she couldn't stop vomiting. By then it was too late. It had rooted too deep to cut out, and she didn't want chemo.
Her eyes watered as she slumped back against the wall, his bright eyes going dim as she forced him to relive the memory. She clenched her jaw and pushed on.
He needs to believe me. You weren't with her when she died. You wanted to be. You were in their house. Had been since you found out. And your dad took shift to let you rest.
His eyes went glossy and red as he crossed his arms, shuffling between feet before he wiped his mouth to cover the trembling lip. His voice wasn't broken when he spoke, and it was only because he tried too hard to keep it steady. That's public record. Anyone sick enough to look can find that. For a moment, he scowled at her, the cold pain turning into a lightning bolt of anger.
The last thing she said was to tell you where your letters were. She'd kept every one of them you wrote.
Her eyes watered as she wiped her mouth and hugged her arms tighter around her stomach.
She'd turned them into a book.
The anger dropped from his face as glassy eyes dried and goosebumps washed over his whole body.
She called it Luke's Letters of Love.
They stared at one another for a long moment before Luke nodded, face blank and eyes distant as they bore through the floor, and he sank onto his bed. She went to say something, but he raised his hand, mumbling for her to give him a minute. She did, several, before she sank to her knees and took his hands. He found her eyes almost reluctantly, open mouth clicking shut then open again as he searched for words. She sighed and smiled a frown.
My dreams are real, Luke. The man is real. I don't think I know what he is, but he's real.
He licked his lips, nodding slowly before his eyes went distant again, became alive with 100 questions. Then he grinned and squeezed her hands. It's real, he said with a chuckle. What do you think it is? An alien from another dimension? An AI? What does it want? Has it told you what the structure does, if anything? His face beamed like the inquisitive kid he still was on the inside.
He says he and his people were made by someone else, the only one of his kind, but they haven't built anything. He says they come from the heaven above heaven, that the same one who made his people and the structure guided us here to watch it do its work, that he wants nothing more than for us to learn from him.
Luke's eyebrows shot up with an uncomfortable smile. That's all pretty religious, isn't it? She shrugged with a breathy laugh.
I didn't notice. Guess that makes sense for me, though.
So, what is it? The structure? A ship? A weapon?
He calls it an instrument that plays with light instead of sound. But listen, today I had a dream, and when I woke up, I could read the hieroglyphs like I'd read it all my life.
He sat straight, then leaned forward with screwed-up brows, squinting over a grin. All of them? Just like that? She nodded.
The symbols, the grammar, everything just makes sense when I see it. I don't know how to pronounce it. I don't think I could, but I understand it now.
Would you?
Yes!
She laughed, pushing up to her feet.
Pull up the scans. I want to learn as much as we can about everything. I already read a bit. Fascinating. The man said it was all here. What's going on? Why? Who? Bust out the tablet already.
Though they didn't realize it, Jane and Luke sat on his bed, or paced his quarters for the next 7 hours, scouring every surface of the antechamber for the most important lines, focusing on the reliefs and what was around them, the doors to the gardens. A dozen files sat open on his tablet, each for a different note on the grammar, the relevance of text, or notable figures. Then they stumbled on a passage from the base of one of the cherubim, and Jane translated aloud.
Thence, upon the 700th year after its rest, the instrument will rise from the face of the lesser sphere and assume its place between both bodies, the greater and the lesser. And in its fullness, the instrument of light shall shine forth and draw up the plenty from the lands of the spheres in their waking, that they might give glory to he who set their roots within the rock. And once the fullness of its time is come, the instrument shall descend back to the lesser sphere, whose face is upon the greater all the day. Then all their plenty shall be made to rest, until the instrument is roused again into the heavens.
Jane sat back, brows furrowed before her face went slack in the memory of her first dream. The golden light, burning like the sun but without sting to her eyes. The glittering crystal spires as the rings turned in on themselves around the blazing diamond, the warmth and wind falling onto her.
In its fullness it will shine forth and draw up the plenty,
she whispered, grinning as she turned to Luke, face twisted in thought. She took his hand.
I dreamt this.
He opened his mouth to ask what she meant, but Jonas's voice boomed over the intercom. Everyone to the cockpit, now! You're strapping in or so help me, I'll lash you to your beds for the rest of the mission! She and Luke furrowed their brows, but rose and rushed up the ladder for the weightlessness of the shuttle, coasting in alongside Micah as he pushed ahead of them for the cockpit. What's the matter? Then he stopped and stared, drifting forward. Oh my God. Jane and Luke came in last, Jonas and Andrea already strapped into their seats, and their pilot shouting over his shoulder, Strap in, now! But Jane couldn't look away. Even as her body moved on its own and dragged Luke with her, she stared through the aerogel-reinforced windows as the structure lurched up above Charon like it had been flung. Earth and dust exploded up in an arcing dome that crashed back to the satellite and settled in the massive crater it left behind. The structure climbed into the shadow of Charon, kilometer after kilometer, bringing a train of dust and debris with it. Lower in shields! Everyone brace! Jonas called out, flipping the security switches and punching the button before the gold-lined blast shields slowly slid over the windows. Jane swallowed as the structure's rings turned at the equator of the opalescent diamond in the center, then end over end in giant arcs as it breached the shadow and glinted gold in the sunlight. The shields locked in place as Andrea and Jonas busied with the controls, pulling up camera feeds on all their monitors. "Engaging secondary shields," Jonas breathed, slamming the blue button as Andrea did its twin. The shuttle shook as the outer shielding lifted over the cockpit at steep angles. Coupled with the charge skin, any debris should at least slow down if they hit them. But Jane didn't care. Even as her hands lashed at her armrests, she glued her eyes to the monitor in the wall to her right. The instrument crested higher and higher as boulders flew like bullets off Charon. Golden arms swung and danced like cogs in a watch as the diamond came into the sunlight and glowed, sparking with the sunlight at first, then glimmering brighter, barely perceptible, as it swam through the void without a single push of flame or thruster. Below, Charon was a mess of dust and earth, but the crater the instrument had been in was a sea of smoke, or mist. Silver, white, and yellow haze glistened in the shadow of the moon, clouds rolling up over the crater rim and crawling over the jagged mountains made by the disembarking instrument. "Brace for impact!" Jonas screamed as debris rushed out in a shapeless cloud. Rocks flew at them and bounced off the outer shields with thunderous bangs and crunches that shook the ship. Bigger rocks, too, slammed into them and spun them around. Jane and Micah both cried out as the ship rolled and twirled. Jonas strained and grunted as he fought for the thrusters and correctors to realign the ship. "That's it, I'm taking us into Charon's shadow." "No!" Micah shouted as more debris bounced off the positive charge of the shields. "The journey would expose our sides. Keep the outer shields facing the debris." Jonas cursed and cursed again before he busied himself, correcting their alignment with each hit. Jane would have shut her eyes to pray, should have done, and though her mouth did move in whispered prayer, her eyes couldn't leave the instrument. It twirled like a dancer, glittering in the sunlight as the dust and ice cracked and sloughed away, letting the crystal spires burst with rainbows, the rings spinning faster and faster as it crept toward the L1 point. Jane smiled.
After its rest, the instrument will rise from the face of the lesser sphere and assume its place between both bodies.
She laughed with wet eyes.